Hi, can you hear me? Hi, so nice to see you, Sunita.
Hi.
Hi, guys.
Hi, Sunita. I'm Dara.
Hey Claire. Hey
Hi,
Dara.
it's so nice to
Nice
see
to
you.
meet.
Yeah, nice to see you.
Oh,
Thanks for having me, Claire.
Yeah, I know we're both just totally crazed.
um, yeah, this has been a crazy time for everyone, I think.
yeah.
This week
Uh,
feels particularly intense too. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm glad that we can do this together. These conversations have been great. I've just been doing them for a couple months now, and every week I just feel like every week during this experience of COVID and quarantine has been different and hard in different ways. And being able to come here and to kind of talk about grief and loss of and end of life and what's happening in our world with people like yourself has been really great. I think it's been really healing for the people who come to these talks, and it's been healing
Yeah.
for us too. Dara's enjoying it.
yeah,
Yeah.
I am. I'm really, yeah, it's been, yeah, it's definitely one of my favorite parts of the week now. And just, the response that people have had to it. And actually we have the largest number of registrants we've had so far. We have about 180 people signed up,
Oh,
which
wow.
yeah, we can expect. I'm guessing probably like 100 or a little bit more than
Mm-hmm.
that will actually show up, and then people will watch the recording afterwards. But yeah, and it's just a very engaged audience.
It is.
So
That's
Yeah, so
great.
Dara usually does like a little intro about Reimagine and then how this is going to work today, and kind of like goes through some technicals, and then she'll introduce me, and then I will introduce you.
Awesome.
And then we're just really gonna have a conversation. Like, I don't ever plan out questions in
Oh,
advance.
yeah, that's
So I just
perfect.
want to, like, you and I know each other too. And
Yeah.
I'll probably start by kind of asking you a little bit about like how the last few months have been for you personally, professionally, like what your thoughts are. And then I do want to talk a little bit about this week and what's been going on with racial tensions and kind of grief around that in our
Yep.
country. But I also want to like still talk to you about just kind of grief and anxiety in general that's really come up for everybody during COVID, and
Yep.
kind of ways that we can help, what you're seeing in the hospital. One of the topics that I feel like is really helpful and important to talk about right now is how to say goodbye to people who are dying in
Yep.
isolation, or support someone who's grieving that or going through that, saying goodbye to someone. So we had Ira Byack on last week, and we had some
Oh, I
discussions about
love
that.
him.
I know it was a
I
great hour. But you are like in there on the front lines of that. So I would really love to kind of touch on that
totally.
somewhat.
And it's been an intense week, man. I feel like what's interesting is that patients or families of patients with COVID are a
Mhm.
lot more open to having realistic end of life discussions than people whose loved ones don't have COVID.
Yeah.
Like, I'm dealing with a couple cases right now that are truly morally distressing, like patients with really clear advance directives whose families are like going against them, or patients who are at the like end stage ALS at home on a vent with a G tube, and the family telling me, oh no, she's nowhere near the end of life.
Wow.
I mean, it's been really hard, to be honest, so this will be a good place to chat about it. Also, I need some referrals from you for grief therapists in Southern California. I was going to send someone your way also. So after this, I can give you kind of info. You're doing sessions, right? Like therapy
I
sessions or
am, and
not?
I'm doing sessions. I'm right now in the process of creating a COVID loss support group that's going to start in
Oh, good.
July.
Okay.
So I'll have information for you about that. I'm starting it with a
That
colleague
would
of
be
mine
great.
who is in LA. And then I just joined the board of a new company called Near, and their plan is to be like a one-stop shop for grief therapists and
Okay.
doulas and end-of-life care. So I'm currently cultivating that. Everyone is asking for grief support right now. And
Yep.
I was having a conversation with a colleague of mine yesterday, there aren't a lot of grief therapists. Like there's a lot of grief centers and kind of organizations that will do grief group support. There aren't as many like kind of one-on-one specialty grief therapists like me, but what's happening is a lot of general therapists or therapists who specialize in other things are starting to incorporate grief. So I'm also talking about doing some trainings for therapists who want to take on more grief in their practices.
Yes.
I'm getting a lot of requests from other therapists around the country that want to do like a consult with me for the cases that they have coming up. So it's an interesting time, and I'm trying to do a lot of work right now to like help build the grief therapist community and network it.
Well, you're the perfect person to do it, because there's a lot of charlatans running around out there saying that they're grief therapists and
I know.
like they're not. So, so I'm glad you're doing this, Claire.
Thanks. Yeah. So definitely hit me up or send people my way. I'm really actively working on all of that. I'm like drowning in work, but I know
I feel like, bad sending you more work, but I also don't trust anyone else. So like,
I feel like I've been working my whole life for this kind of moment. Like, if I can't step up now, I don't know what the point of it, all this work I've been doing is. So
I don't know how you balance it all with kids and just, I don't know how you do it.
It's not easy. I've been crying a lot, but I mean,
I know. Yeah.
It is hard.
It's hard to hold all of that.
You ready?
Well, I just wanted to say, I'm going to do a moment of silence at the beginning for George Floyd. Yeah. And just other people have also died at the hands of the police, and just say something, just sort of,
that's great.
Just from personal, whatever. And just sort of how Reimagine is approaching this. And and I guess I don't know if you, like, I don't want to mess up your flow, Claire, but I kind of feel like since it's so on the front and center, like, I don't know if you just kind of want to get into that quicker than, I mean, obviously giving context for Sunita is important, but I also just feel like just in the timing of this anyway. So just, do whatever feels like good for you, but that's just,
okay. I can go there right away.
Okay. Does that sound okay, Sunita?
That sounds awesome. I just got a quick text from work. I'm going to respond.
Okay. I'm going to share my screen and pull up the slides, and it won't be on slides for most of it. It's just for the beginning.
Can you guys hear that bird?
Oh, can you hear that cat?
I love that bird.
My cat, of course, comes in right at this moment. Okay, chat. Sorry, I'm gonna. Okay, I'm gonna let everyone in. Okay, so everyone's coming now, and it'll fill up in a second. Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started in just a minute or so. If you want to put in the chat where you're from and just a word around how you're feeling today, that would be great. And if you can mute your mics, I'm going to try to mute some of you. Great. And if you're just joining, if you just want to share where you're from and maybe a word about how you're feeling. And I'm sorry that you can hear my cat in the background. I just fed him again so he wouldn't do this, but let me see if I can get somebody to move the cat.
My cat is going to start meowing at your cat.
It's like,
I have one sitting here on the table.
Sammy, well, yeah, let's see.
last week my cat started having a battle with this plant behind me while I was in conversation with Dr. Bayak. It was really cool. Did you see that, Sarah?
No, I didn't notice.
Welcome, everybody.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, we're just excited to get started today, and
oh my gosh, hold on one second. I'm just gonna move.
Sunita, do you have your chat open? It's so cool to see where everybody is coming in from. If you hit the chat button at the bottom.
And this is the greatest number of people signed up for this webinar?
So far, yeah, we have 80 signups for this one, which is
That's
amazing.
awesome.
It's just growing every week.
That's amazing.
Honored that you guys are all here with us today. We'll let Dara do some things.
Yeah, so I'm gonna kick things off. Welcome to Holding Space with Claire Bidwell Smith and Dr. Sunita Puri. My name is Dara Cosberg, and I'm the program director of Reimagine. And as a nonprofit organization, we spark community experiences like this one that empower individuals, families, and communities to face the hardest parts of our existence, including illness and death, while inspiring people to celebrate life and one another. And I actually just want to start today by taking just a moment of silence to honor the life of George Floyd and the countless number of Black and Brown people who have died at the hands of the police. So you can just take a minute. We're just gonna pause. So it's really hard to know what to say right now. You know, I'm angry and sad, but I am also hopeful that George Floyd's murder will help break down some of the systemic racism in this country. And, you know, here at Reimagine, we are continuing to be committed to breaking down the inequities around life and death. You know, we're trying to work on some programming and also working with our collaborators who are hosting these events to address this topic. So look out for that. I also just want to say, and I'll post information about this at the end, that we are hosting a vigil to honor those who have died through police violence as well as COVID on June 9th. And so I welcome you to join that as well. So now I'm just gonna do some housekeeping before we launch into the program. First off, I just want to thank our sponsors who support Reimagine and make this work possible. So thank you, all of these sponsors. And then this is Sammy, was the cat on the left, who's talking. So just so you know, you can turn on and off your mic with the little microphone. If you are on a phone, if you called in, you can use *6 to unmute yourself. We are going to do a Q&A at the end. You can turn on and off your camera, although we invite you to use your camera since it just makes us all feel more connected. You can use the chat box to write questions and comments. And if the chat box is distracting to you, you can click the little arrow in the right-hand corner.
Ruhi?
Oh.
Ruhi?
Oh, here, I'm just gonna mute. Okay, so I'm gonna introduce Claire, and then here, and maybe I'm just gonna mute. Oh. I'm Okay, so I'm going to introduce Claire, Claire Bidwell Smith, who is an internationally renowned author, speaker, and grief expert. She's the author of 3 books of nonfiction, The Rules of Inheritance, After This, When Life is Over, Where Do We Go? And Anxiety, The Missing Stage of Grief. And you're in for a wonderful conversation. So I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, Dan.
And oh wait, is Sunita? Okay, great. She's unmuted now. Okay, I'm just gonna exit my screen.
Thank you, Dara. Hi, everybody. I am so happy and honored to be with you guys today. For those of you who are joining for the first time, and for all of you who are here, I started doing these conversations a couple of months ago, right when COVID started to happen in our country, and I just felt like we needed a place to come every week and talk about everything we were feeling, the grief, the anxiety, just the way that our world was changing. And I've been inviting these amazing people in the death and dying space to come and join me. There's nobody better than these incredible guests that I've been having. And the interesting thing over the last couple of months is that every single week has been different. And I'm sure that you are all feeling this too. I feel like every single week of the last few months has been its own year almost. But this last week has been a particularly intense and heavy and just eye-opening week for all of us. And so I'm really happy to have Sunita here today. Dr. Sunita Puri is the medical director of the Palliative Medicine Service at Keck Hospital and Norris Cancer Center of the University of Southern California, where she also serves on the chair of the ethics committee. Sunita is also the author of That Good Night, which is just an incredible book about end of life that you guys should all put on your list if you have not already. And I am so happy to have her here today to kind of just start to talk about, we're going to talk today about a lot of just grief and death and end of life that's going on for all of us during COVID. But I want to start by talking about the grief we're feeling in our country right now for everything that's going on. Welcome, Sunita, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for everyone for joining at this really difficult moment.
Yeah. I know that you are on the front lines right now, and I want to talk and hear a little bit about that, but I mean, you're also just on the kind of front lines of what's happening in our country in some ways, of just being out in the world, being a physician, being in Los Angeles, being a woman of color. You know, talk to us about how is everything for you, and how has this last week been for you?
Yeah. So I think this last week has kind of been, it's added a really thick emotional layer to the layered experience that I'd already had being on the front lines as a palliative care doctor. And I think, you know, COVID almost seemed to unite a lot of elements of humanity. There's my cat's tail. I'm just going to move her over here. Thank you, baby. But I think COVID, there were moments where I could feel that people were actually a bit more united than they might have been in the past, because we were all in this together. We were all facing this invisible terror that could take anyone's life at any time. And it really didn't discriminate based on age, background, health status, or anything like that. But now I think we're in a moment of a lot of disunity, and that's putting it mildly. I think every time something like this happens to Black people in the United States, I keep hoping that will be the last time, because there will be change. And my heart is really broken, because I don't know if this is going to be the moment where there will be the change we're hoping for. I really want that to be the case, but I'm nervous to expect that because of our really sordid history of being disunified, of being at each other's throats, of having such deep disagreement about the dignity and sanctity of all lives. And I think as a palliative care doctor, you know, attending to dignity at the end of someone's life is my main purpose. That also begins way before somebody is in the process of dying. Our field is really about maintaining comfort and quality of life and dignity at all stages of an illness, even from the time of diagnosis. And so to have watched a video where a man died with such indignity for no reason at all was a blow to me on multiple levels. My dad and my brother have both been harassed by the police, nothing near the level of George Floyd or the many other Black men and women who have died in recent months. But I can't imagine the outrage if they had been victims of the same thing. And so, and I know I will never know what it is like to live with that constant fear of being Black and in the United States. I think after 9/11, our community was in a lot of fear because Sikhs and Hindus were targeted for being quote unquote terrorists based on the way we looked. But I just come back to this idea that how can a human being not see another person in front of them as a fellow human being? Mm-hmm. And why are we in America so mired in this mess of racism and division when really, I think the point of a human life from a spiritual perspective is to realize your unity with everybody else. And I know that was kind of a long answer to your question, but I'm having trouble, as I'm sure many of the people on this call are, with reconciling a core set of values that many of us believe in with the reality that continues to play itself out way too often.
No, that's a beautiful answer, and so insightful. You know, I too felt that we had unified in some ways when this first happened. And it was kind of amazing to see people coming together and all of us experiencing a lot of similar emotions. As someone who's been in the grief world for so long, I know that grief can be very lonely and isolating. So to have this kind of short-lived moment where I saw everyone grieving, you know, just grieving the life we were living, grieving people we were losing, grieving just the systemic breakdown of things was really kind of beautiful. But that feels kind of gone now. We feel very back to being very, very much divided and kind of broken in many ways. I think that COVID has been it's been like a magnifying glass. It's kind of amplified and illuminated so many issues that were all here, like so many things that were already present. Problems with our healthcare systems and you know, problems with our administrations and state levels and federal level, many things, marriages, like on tiny levels, you know, you're seeing cracks in your family life and your friend's life and those things. And then we're seeing these like really macro level issues as well. And I think that this last week has just been just blown it all up. And my only hope, I feel like I'm sitting with a lot of heaviness and sadness right now and just kind of often a lot of despair. But my hope is that all of these breakdowns will lead to change. But like you said, I mean, this has happened so many times. How do you have space for these feelings, this despair, this kind of existential crisis that we're going through in some ways?
So I think, you know, when I was kind of socialized as a physician going through my training, even in palliative care, so much of what we're taught by example is to hold yourself together in the eye of the storm so you can be strong for the patients and families you're working with. And I would always go in the room, I still go in the room when I'm seeing patients and families, imagining that I'm the rock in the ocean. Like I have to stay steady as all the turbulence goes on around me. And I think the tragic downside of that is that I never really learned how to deal with my grief as a physician. And I think when you're socialized so strongly in that way, attending to grief in other parts of your life can also become challenging because that persona is what you use so many hours of your week, so many hours of your life. I think as a writer, that's where I've found space to articulate my grief. And that's where when I set my doctory side aside, I can inhabit my writer side, which is really, I think, the most authentic version of me that's emotional and in touch and allows space for expression. I think what's difficult amidst COVID is a lot of what I see in the hospital and have experienced myself is this idea of disenfranchised grief, where we're just not allowed to express what we're going through. And I think when that becomes so much second nature, at some point the levees break and you are experiencing all the grief that you were never allowed to experience before. And in COVID, I think it's an interesting moment because we see pictures of doctors in the media grieving. We are hearing stories about that. We've seen physicians kill themselves because of the enormity of what's being asked of us right now. And what I have to do to hold space for my grief about what I'm seeing in the hospital and what I'm seeing unfold in the world is really by being in nature. I go out, I go on a walk with my dog, and sometimes I don't take him. I just go out, walk around the reservoir that's near me, look at a tree, and remind myself that that tree has been here for like probably over 100 years. Everything that tree has seen is metaphoric of what we see in this human life. And so how can we try to allow ourselves to grieve while remembering that we also have the capability to use whatever storm we're in the midst of and make ourselves stronger? And so but I think it's still hard for me to grieve openly. I haven't cried in a long time. And it was when I saw that video that I started crying. And I think, grief is also deeply personal, how we express it. For a long time, it was me shutting down. And now I think we have a moment where we are more collectively grieving, where it is more socially acceptable to say, I'm going through a hard time. Are you going through a hard time? I'm less kind of sewn to the persona that I'm being asked to put up in the hospital.
That's beautiful. I always love to listen to you talk. If anyone
you're so sweet.
haven't read her book is just as beautiful and lyrical, and the words are so well chosen. Sunita has a real mastery of language. So many things to say. I am so glad you're touching on this grief. There's a lot of what can we do happening right now, which is really important. And there are so many incredible suggestions of what we can do. But I think there are also some internal things that we need to be doing. And one of those is like really sitting with and allowing ourselves to feel grief, shame, sadness, all the things that are coming up. Because when we don't let those things flow through us, they bottle up and manifest in poor outcomes.
Sorts of ways. Yeah.
I think you and I both share a love of writing.
Yeah.
And that be an outlet for grief. I think that just journaling in the morning or writing letters or just kind of pouring out, writing your story is a great way. What are some ways that you feel are helpful to move through grief? I know you're also deeply spiritual, so I'd love to hear anything along those lines as well.
I think number one, recognizing that you're grieving is really important. And I am the biggest failure in that regard for many years because I almost felt like I wasn't allowed to grieve. Mm-hmm. Either things in my personal life or things that I saw at work, because everyone around me, I told myself, was going through so much more. Mm-hmm. So it was kind of this like first allowance of myself to confront the fact that I was grieving. I had a very difficult 2019 in my personal life. I mean, the book came out and that was incredible. And that was pretty much the rope that I clung to, bring myself out of a turbulent ocean. It was a very difficult year. And yet I didn't cry about it for months and months and months. And I think, first of all, allowing myself to know I'm not a robot. I can't hold everybody else's grief and allow that to fill up my vessel without actually making space for my own. Mm-hmm. And so the first thing was just recognizing that I had things to grieve. The second thing was kind of understanding that you can deal with grief in many ways. It's not always therapy. It's not always walks in nature. Sometimes it's just really hard cardio and like allowing your body to just get out what your cells are storing. I found exercise and yoga really helpful, but I also found reading and praying really helpful. I turned to poetry and to books, and I still do, to help me remember that I wasn't alone in my grief. And I think that's sometimes the best way to remember you're not alone is to pick up a book that addresses grief so beautifully. recently I've been rereading Letters from a Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King. And there's just so many gems of wisdom in there about what it means for a society to finally come to terms with how interconnected we are, and how the only thing that can disperse hate is love. And these radical ideas of kind of pushing back against the hatred of the times, that helps me remember the grief I'm feeling has always been felt. I read Tiny Beautiful Things by Cheryl Strayed. I think that's just an electrifying group of essays. And I remember that, everything I'm feeling is legitimate, and that so many people have walked in my shoes before. It's not me being a big fat weirdo that I'm sitting on my couch and crying and unable to lift myself up some days. It's the human experience. And I think embracing that and remembering we don't have to act like something we're not, especially when we're alone with ourselves and the people we love. Our responsibility to ourselves is to accept what we're feeling as authentic, and then to find a way, whether it's exercise, prayer, journaling, reading, writing, bitching with friends, all of that. Now you have a cattail. I love the symmetry of this. And I think on that note, animals have been very healing for me, because what does a cat or dog do? They live entirely in the moment. And that, I think, is part of what it means to move through grief, is to move through the moments, knowing that it is temporary, just like all things in life.
Thank you. Tell us what you're experiencing with patients and families in the hospital right now, and end of life and COVID, and how things are going with that, and how you're taking care of yourself through this experience.
Yeah. It's been intense in the hospital, I think, for many reasons. When COVID was first starting, just getting into preparation mode was very intense. I was charged with the task of writing a resource allocation policy if we were ever to run low on ICU beds or ventilators, and how those would be distributed. So even just slipping into that mode was extremely anxiety provoking, and it was against everything that I'd been trained to do in medicine. Thankfully, we have not had to use that, but every patient who came in, I felt like the care of them was extra intense, because we were sometimes the only humans around them, that their families were not allowed to come in, for good reason in a way, because if we're trying to contain a pandemic, we want to expose the fewest possible people to folks who are ill. We want to expose the fewest number of patients to people who are really sick in the hospital. But the cost of that has been people dying alone, people dying in a lot of pain that is not physical pain, but is a type of suffering that comes only with being apart from people you love. I've seen also the tragedy of people getting really sick and never having had a conversation about what's important to them in their life, and what sort of medical interventions would advance their goals and what matters to them the most. So I think it was added intensity for me to be having those discussions over Zoom with family members if patients were intubated in the ICU. And I think if COVID has shown us anything, it's that it has pushed mortality like in bright neon lights in front of every one of our faces, because we can't avoid, we're all equally susceptible in a lot of ways to this deadly disease, but we are all going to face mortality. It's just that when you have to have those discussions, when families aren't there, and you're having them when their loved one is sick with a disease that's all over the news and there's a lot of panic and anxiety around it, that took those discussions to another level. Especially since I couldn't talk to people in person. The other tragedy I've seen, I'm dealing with a couple cases where this is the case now, is patients who don't have COVID, but who have other serious illnesses, who would not seek care because they were afraid of getting COVID, and they were being advised to stay at home. I had one patient recently who had a significant heart health history, a cardiac history, who wasn't going to the doctor during COVID because he had chest pains. He was like, I'll be okay. And then he had a full-on cardiac arrest and was down for 20 minutes. And we got him in, we put him on a bypass machine called ECMO. He was on a ventilator, he was on continuous dialysis. and his heart recovered, but his brain never came back from having been down for 20 minutes. And I have another young man right now who has metastatic cancer. It's a very aggressive cancer. He'd had pain for a while, but didn't come in because he didn't want to get COVID and because he was so afraid of it. And so we're seeing now these consequences and the unfolding of other tragedies because of what COVID, the kind of environment and the fear that COVID has stoked in doctors and patients alike. But having to support them through this added layer of tragedy that they didn't seek help when they might have wanted to, that's a new type of grief that I'm helping people deal with. And that's very distressing. And in terms of caring for myself through this, I'm the first to admit I'm still learning how to take care of myself. Like a few years ago, my team social worker, who's an amazing social worker, asked me, what are you doing to take care of yourself? And I literally had to ask him, what do you do to take care of yourself? Like, what does that actually mean? Mm-hmm. Isn't it just eating, sleeping enough, kind of going about your day? And he was shocked that I had to ask that question. And I was shocked and a little ashamed that I had to as well. So what I do now is I really try to take care of myself in ways I hadn't before. And that it might be counterintuitive to use this example, but Claire, I wrote my whole book sitting on this sofa that I'm sitting on now. I didn't even have a writing desk until I purchased one a couple weeks ago. Like, I didn't attend to some of the things that might seem really basic to others, but as a doctor, you put all of that aside to take care of people. That bled into the rest of my life in an unfortunate way. So even in addition to addressing my grief and exercising, doing yoga, praying, reading, writing, being with my animals, being with the people I love, I've started to attend to just my physical space and my physical needs in ways that I hadn't before. And that makes a huge difference to know that you're caring for yourself, and you can almost care for patients better when you do that.
Yeah. Wow. We are going to open it up to questions soon. So if you guys want to start putting anything in the chat box, or you can also raise your hand on your profile. But Sunita, what can we be doing? What can we learn from this and start doing better at end of life, preparing for it before we're in a situation like this, before we're at the hospital with COVID or what's happening? What can we be doing now?
Yeah. I think the number one thing is to actually meditate on your mortality and come to an understanding and even an acceptance that it is that makes this life beautiful, because it's finite and we don't know how much time we have. And so living every day to the fullest and looking at yourself and realizing, what does that mean for me? Does living my life well mean that I can walk around, feed myself, interact with my family? And what sort of quality of life would not fill my days with the sort of life I would want? So even starting really basic there and talking to your loved ones about that, I think is really important. And then I think engaging your doctors, because I think sometimes people think we just get to make choices and tick boxes off on advanced directives, but it's a lot more complicated than that. So for example, I often see patients who come in with end stage, either organ failure like liver failure from cirrhosis or heart failure or advanced cancer. And they have an advanced directive that says, I want everything done for me. Full care, prolonged life support, CPR, and so forth. And what I'd have to do with them is to revisit those choices in the context of their current state. And that, I think, is what's left out of a lot of discussions, that it's not just checking boxes, it's engaging with your doctor about those choices and having them weigh in. That may sound paternalistic, because I think we operate in a medical culture where patients think whatever they want is what doctors will do. But especially when it comes to end of life choices, really understanding what CPR looks like, who was it invented for, will it help me at all? You know, would a ventilator be appropriate if I have end stage emphysema, and if I go on a vent, I may never come off of one?
Mm-hmm.
So that decision making involves your family and your own reflections on your values, but it also very much, I think the missing piece is that we don't engage with our doctors about what are realistic choices. And then people come in to me when I, as a stranger in the hospital, and I have to rehash that. So I think the more you can work with the doctors you trust to have that honest discussion with them and your families, the better you will be served if an emergency occurs.
Really quick, and then I'm going to start asking some of these questions in the chat, but what do you do when you have family members or loved ones who are resistant to these conversations? Do you have tips for this? I think this is something a lot of us run up against, you know. Even me, I work in the death and dying space, and my husband doesn't want to talk about this stuff. Like, he doesn't want to talk about death and end of life planning. And so, and I know I'm not alone in experiencing this. What are your suggestions and tips for kind of engaging people on this topic?
So it's funny you ask that, because the vast majority of the patients and families I'm working with right now fall into that category. And I think what I try to do is approach things with a totally open mind and try to get from them, where is the resistance coming from? And you want to use your empathy and your presence and making space for them to try to soften that resistance. Sometimes you have time to do it and sometimes you don't. And so depending on the situation, I handle it with different degrees of space and time. I think it's really important. I wish we had an enormous cultural change in this country so that people would try to accept death as a natural part of life that we need to talk about and prepare for, just like we talk about and prepare for big car accidents or something happening to our house. We have insurance policies for the things that are likely or that may happen. Death is going to happen. And so how can we communicate about it in a way that's safe? I've also come to accept that even with my best efforts, some families will not listen. Some patients will not listen, and I will not be able to give them a dignified death. And I have had to make peace with that as well. But I think the key is really exploring what the resistance is. And I think a lot of the time, Claire, the resistance is that they don't understand how sick their loved one is. And that, coming back to that and making sure they understand that, is the place where resistance can soften. It's not that there's a cure for this cancer. It's that the treatment is buying time. It is not necessarily buying quality time, and it will not prevent death. And being able to honestly say that, I think, is so hugely important. And we in medicine have a very hard time telling somebody that we can't cure this or we can't treat this.
From my perspective, as someone who sees families after a loved one has died and they're just trying to understand everything that led up to it and grapple with decisions they made or didn't make. I see it's almost 50-50. I see a large part of denial on the family members' space, where they're really not able to face the fact that their person is dying. But then I also see half of that responsibility on the medical community.
Yes.
Really not helping families understand what's happening and face the death. So there's this kind of dual thing that's happening that ends up, there's a question here from Nancy that says families often feel guilt after a death. What do we do? How do you talk to families about this? And this is where, and I see it largely in part because they did not realize that their person was going to die so quickly or at all. And it's really kind of a double thing. I have to close the door because there's a noise, but you start answering.
So I think this is a great question. And I do think some of the guilt arises from uninformed decision-making. So there's a couple ways to think about this. One, and a lot of the work I have to do with my colleagues is supporting them in concisely and truthfully revealing the facts. I think it's really hard for us to do that. And so helping doctors learn how to communicate better and not being afraid to say what is, not what we hope for, not what we want to avoid, but what are the facts. I think sometimes, ironically, surgeons do this the best, because they will say to a family, your loved one is so sick they wouldn't survive a surgery and I'm not offering it. So there's not a choice put to the family. And I think that is actually a big way that we need to advance in medicine, because we offer choices that end up being uninformed because families don't know how sick their loved one is. And quite honestly, for a lot of doctors, it's easier to put the choices out to the family and have them bear the burden of decision making. And we can kind of stand back and say, we did what the family wanted. But what the family wanted, I think, was many times fundamentally uninformed. And that's, I think, where guilt comes from. That's why I'm a big proponent of saying, if somebody is so sick that all we're doing is prolonging suffering, to take certain options off the table, because to offer them as choices, I think, is really unfair to families who are grieving, who are sometimes desperate for any straw of hope. But what we're actually doing is giving them false hope and causing them suffering as well as their loved one. So that's sort of bravery or moral courage to say, I care a lot about you, and that's why I've got to be honest with you about the fact that your loved one is dying. And the question to you is, how would he want to live this time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I'm skipping around in some of these questions, and we'll try to get to all of them, but I want to stay on our kind of topic where we're going with this. Here's one from Emma that says, my parents are 80 and 82 and super healthy. They have just said, we don't want to be a burden and please no interventions. But that assumes that one day they will simply have a stroke, heart attack, or accident. What questions should I be asking them around care, support, assistance way before they might die, but just as they deteriorate? I also want to support them and not be violent in my questions. We have actually had a lot of death in the family, so these questions are welcome. I'm just not sure what to ask.
That is such a great question, because I think the way a lot of discussions are framed, they're framed around a big accident or a big heart attack, being in the ICU. But the kind of natural winding down of the body and asking people what they want in that context is a slightly different discussion. First of all, I'm so glad that your parents are healthy and that they're with you and that you can have this discussion with them. I think the fact that you've had death in the family may be an interesting starting point. A lot of the discussions that I encourage people to have are looking at other deaths in the family and asking their loved one, what did you think about how this person died? Would that be the sort of way you would want to live out the rest of your life? I hear that you don't want to be a burden, but I want you to expand on what that means. If, for example, you needed total care, you were totally dependent on others for toileting, for, everything, would that be the sort of, is that what you mean by being a burden? Tell me more what that looks like to you. And did you think, Auntie Jane was a burden because she had that sort of prolonged dying process? And I think starting there could lead to some really interesting conversations. And I totally understand not wanting to be violent in questions, which is why framing it as from a place of concern that I want to do what's right by you. And I want to know what you mean when you visualize being a burden. How do you think what would you want me to do that would avoid that sort of situation? And I think the earlier those conversations start, the better you can kind of gather information over time, rather than having to have a discussion in the midst of a true crisis.
Yeah, thank you. Paula wants to know, are doctors prepared to discuss end of life with us?
That's a great question too. And I think it really depends on, I know there's people worldwide listening to this, so I can speak only to the American experience. There is no standardized curriculum in medical training, in medical school in particular, that prepares people to have these discussions. At USC, I teach one workshop in all 4 years of medical school called Breaking Bad News. And that's the students' opportunity to, for me to give them a lecture, for them to practice with a standardized patient and to get feedback on it. But of course, these skills are a lot more complex than that. And I feel a certain amount of anger, to be honest, that we don't prepare doctors to do this better, Because I will tell you, some of the things that eat away at most of us are not necessarily that someone didn't respond to chemo or someone's in the ICU for weeks despite our best efforts. It's more so, how do we be honest and talk to someone about whether they're suffering, what sort of suffering they would endure and not endure, what sort of quality of life they value. Those are lacking those skills, I think, are a source of a tremendous amount of distress for doctors. And I think the consequences are what patients bear, that they suffer the consequences of us not being trained in our profession to have these discussions. And so I'm a huge advocate, and something I hope will change in the future is that it's not, that people have the skills because they were lucky enough to be at one school or one residency program, but that it is actually a requirement by the American College of Graduate Medical Education to have a certain standardized curriculum and to have everybody going into medicine rotate on a palliative care service. Because that's where I've seen with my students, they see for the first time how, instead of backing away from a difficult discussion, how do you engage with it in a compassionate and concise way that honors everybody in the room, but that also seeks to do what's right by the patient. And that is a skill set that, honestly, if I had even started to learn in my medical school training, I would have spared myself a lot of suffering in residency. And a lot of what I write about in my book are instances where I felt I didn't have the words. I could intubate people, I could put needles in them to take fluid out, I could run CPR like a pro, but I had no idea how to actually talk people through the significance of what I was doing and ask them whether what I was going to do really aligned with the sort of life they want for themselves. So it's my absolute hope that one day this will change, because I think we'll have a more humane system of medicine in this country.
Is there a movement towards it? I mean, is there progress being made? It seems kind of impossible to imagine that there just isn't more of this,
Yeah. I think there's a big push for it, but I think what's difficult in medical education is that there's a certain number of topics that are covered on board exams, and palliative care and ethics are not really big subjects. And so when people teach towards the boards, then there's not enough room in the curriculum to actually teach these other skills. And the students are terrified. I mean, I feel really badly for them. When they rotate on my service, many of them cry, many of them text or email me late in the night saying, I don't know how to process this, because these aren't situations they're regularly exposed to. And it should be a part of their training, because all doctors will lose patients. All doctors will see patients suffer because of their best efforts. And knowing how to deal with that, I think it's a movement, but it hasn't gotten the traction that I would hope it would get across the country.
I hope this is one of the things that maybe COVID ignites, because I'm hearing, I have, friends in medical communities, I'm hearing it on the news too, that none of the nurses or doctors are prepared. They've never experienced this much death. Either they've never worked ICU, and now they're suddenly just being called to take on these things, and they've never experienced having to talk with families, having to see patients through death. And so I really would hope that maybe one of because obviously there's going to have to be a lot of big medical changes and thought once we kind of come through this and replan how would we deal with this again. I loved last week, Dr. Bayat kept saying this has to be a never again. Like this
yes,
happen this way again. We have got to be prepared and really have thought this out more. But I really hope one of the things that we think about more is better training all medical people in the field of dying and these hard conversations, because you never know when this is going to happen. Something like
never know.
Someone here just said that they're being reminded of these challenges and lessons being advanced during the early years of AIDS. I mean, we have been through this and we haven't made the changes,
We haven't. And I think, I'll be honest, I think the vast majority of my colleagues want these skills. I think they feel badly having to almost outsource difficult communication to me. And why I have them in the meetings all the time is for them to see what it looks like and pick up some of the language. But these are full-fledged attending doctors. many of whom tell me about stories they wish had not happened if only they'd had these skills. So I think people are hungry for it.
Yeah. I'm really grateful for organizations like Endwell, who really
Yes.
help, provide this information, not just to clinicians and professionals, but laymen as well, and just anyone who really wants to kind of further this space. I mean, this is my personal story. My mom died of cancer at 18, and none of us were prepared. None of us understood that she was about to die, least of all me. I wasn't there. It's been the single most traumatic thing in my life that I've had to overcome on so many levels, and the guilt that I had to sit through for years, the guilt that I had to sit with for not being there when she died. But the reason I wasn't there was because I wasn't informed and didn't understand, and she didn't either. None of us did. And so there's so many reasons why that happened the way it did.
Yeah.
And has put me into this field and this space of constantly wanting to try to help change all of these things. Let's see. Elizabeth says she's working with Virginia Mason Hospital in Seattle with a new approach to teaching compassion, which is really cool. Nancy says there's an amazing book leader who's getting medical students trained, Naomi Remen, Kitchen Table Wisdom. Do you know of her, Sunita?
I know her because she's affiliated with UCSF, which is where I did my medical school and residency. I've never met her personally, but I do know back then, I think she offered maybe like a retreat or something like that for medical students around like self-care and burnout, if I'm remembering correctly. So yeah, no, I know she's around. I think that it would be great if that was just integrated into the curriculum rather than being an elective thing. And back when I was there, it was an elective thing, not a standard part of the curriculum. But I think those things should be. And I don't think it's a one-off. Like, I don't think my Breaking Bad news workshop should be a one-time thing. I think it's a building of skills, just like we build other skills. And having a one-time retreat or one-time Breaking Bad thing is not enough. We have to have it integrated. And I hope she has.
Marie here suggests having nurses also take and lead these end-of-life discussion trainings, because, and I think it's not just doctors. I mean, everyone should be able to kind of do this, and nurses especially, who are with the families much more often, or spending more time with them. Someone here asked, and I love asking everyone who comes to have these weekly discussions, how do we cope with people who are dying alone, and then we're not able to have funerals, not able to do usual customs? What are you seeing on your end with that?
I think in general, we are seeing a profound stripping away of rituals. And rituals, I think, are so important, whether it's a wedding or a baptism or a funeral, because we do these ceremonies to have a place to put our most complex feelings. They don't go away once we do these rituals, but we do them to come together and have a structured way of responding to a certain life event. I think the lack of that ritual has been extremely traumatic for every patient I've taken care of recently. I recently had a patient of my own faith looking for a crematorium to, cremate their loved one, and no one would do it. And that was really shocking to me. They couldn't have the traditional Hindu burial practice or cremation practices because it would involve too many people being in one space. And in our religion, that's, I know that this might sound crazy to people, but you want to have male relatives involved in the care and the cremation of the body in order to ascend to your next life. And so the disruption of things like that, I think, have put a lot of people in a huge bind that I don't know how to suggest coming out of. I think one thing that does bind people together is knowing that they're all experiencing the loss of this ritual and finding other ways to honor their loved ones. So another family I worked with recently whose mother died of COVID, they had a very, very small service that was brief. And then everybody who they went to the beach one by one, and everybody kind of put a paper crane into the water to kind of have a way of being with their feelings and allowing this person to go. Yeah. And I thought that was a great social distancing way to do something together collectively that felt like the best ritual in place of a funeral. But I think the disruption of ritual is just, it's a really upsetting part of everything we're going through.
Yeah, I agree. Just being in the space that I'm in, counseling people going through grief for all this time, that is what is such an important component, you know, of processing the loss and honoring the loss.
Yeah.
Doing that. I'm really urging people to, you know, kind of turn to their own spiritual sides, create their own sense of ritual, all alone
Yes.
at home or in these different ways. Like we've been kind of reliant on a certain set of customs in
Yep.
Western culture for a long time around death and dying, but that doesn't mean we can't get creative. It doesn't mean we can't just do things at home. We can make up rituals, you know.
Yep.
And I think
Exactly.
that would be really helpful for people.
I totally agree. And I think this is a time where our creativity is being put to the test. And I do believe there are ways beyond structured rituals that we're so used to honor the people we love and to honor ourselves as a collective set of people grieving.
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. Oh my gosh, it's been amazing to talk with you about all of this. What are we not thinking about here that you are seeing and thinking about, that we can start to kind of make some shifts, or do you think is going to happen for us?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think one of the things that I will always come back to about things we're not doing is finding a way, as whatever community you belong to really contemplate what death means, to contemplate what suffering means, to embrace that suffering is a part of a human life and we can't avoid it. And sometimes by trying to avoid it, especially in situations where someone is dying, we actually cause more suffering.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's something I encourage everybody to find a way to meditate on, to talk about with a faith community, to talk about with other people. So I think it's only in accepting that we're afraid of death and exploring that's the way through. To keep things as they are and to shut the door when we think about mortality, I think that is one of the biggest ways that suffering of everybody involved is perpetuated. There's suffering on the patient, there's suffering on the family who's watching someone die in a way that they may or may not have wanted. And I will say this too, that doctors and nurses suffer when we're being asked to do things that are inhumane and unethical just because a family wants it, because they have not been contemplating what it means to let a natural death unfold. And that might seem like a big ask of families, but I think the earlier we start contemplating this, it might just be easier to hold the space for pulling back from medical interventions that don't make sense and allowing for grace. And I really think remembering that a lot of people suffer when we don't have these conversations, and it's actually not just patients and families. I suffered tremendously. I had nightmares for years from some of the things I was asked to do in my residency because I knew it wasn't right and I didn't know how to talk to people. And I think sometimes families go through that where they might feel what's being offered may not be right, but they don't know how to talk about it. So we're really suffering from a poverty of language around this and a paucity of contemplation. This doesn't make death and loss easier, but it might make facing it a little more gentle.
Amazing. Thank you. A few people wanted to make sure I asked you Vicky's question. She says, I know that I don't want to die on a ventilator, and I wish I knew what support for comfort and breathing there would be specifically short of the feared ventilator. I don't know how to write my final wishes.
Yeah. So if someone is so short of breath that we really need to put them on a ventilator, but that's not within their wishes, there are many ways we can keep people comfortable. So we can always continue to give you supplemental oxygen just through nasal cannula. We give you low doses of morphine and Ativan to ease the experience of not being able to breathe comfortably. I will always ask families or patients themselves, is there particular music that calms you down? Would you want that played at that time? Is there spiritual music you would want played? And I know this sounds super low tech, but having a fan running in the face of somebody who's short of breath actually helps the sensation of lack of breathing much better. So those are the ways we can keep people comfortable when they're dying of end-stage lung disease or dying of low oxygen saturations. It does not need to be a process of gasping and going down with tremendous suffering. And that, I think, in your advance directive, I would say exactly what you would want in place of a ventilator. And that may require writing in or having, your doctor or a lawyer help you find the language to specify what you would want. But we also in medicine try really hard to make sure that we are doing those things automatically when we're not putting somebody on a ventilator. And I think this binary of wanting everything or doing nothing is one that can be broken by specifying your wishes. And we never in medicine do everything like a vent, CPR, all of that, or do nothing. It's always about honoring the dignity of patients. And so that might mean instead of doing nothing, which is what a lot of people perceive, it might mean doing all of those things I mentioned and providing extensive emotional and spiritual support for the person and their family.
Thank you so much, Sunita. This has been such a pleasure. There are so many amazing things going on in the chat with just different ideas and resources and documents, people talking about 5 wishes and the Conversation Project and all of these things. What are ways that everyone here listening and all of us can be ambassadors for just helping people talk more about end of life, and just can we post about on Facebook that we talked about it? Or, I mean, what are things we can do to kind of just keep expanding this realm
conversation? I think there's some interesting movements that pop up all over the country, like Death Over Dinner, as an example, where people gather for a meal. I think that's going to be hard these days, but even over Zoom, it might be possible, and just share stories about and I would encourage starting with, what are deaths you've experienced? What was a good death and what was a bad death? And then collectively thinking about, what would you want for yourself if you were faced with these choices? And there's different scenarios to contemplate, but facing it head on in community and working on reflecting on your fear of mortality individually, I think that can be a really powerful combination. I think going to churches and other faith communities, that's also a way to find a space to reflect on this, because all religions offer guidance and wisdom about what it means to live a human life and what it means to depart from a human life. And I think that can be a really powerful place to start. And I think for those who are not ready to start those discussions, even journaling about it or reading things about how other people face death, I think that can be a really, really powerful way to get your own thoughts going and to get you out of your fear and into even someone else's experience, because that might also help soften your resistance. I do see a question from somebody here about how you can request a palliative care consult. So patients and families can always request one. It differs across institutions about whether the request is automatically honored or whether it needs to be approved by the doctor taking care of the patient. But most of the time, the doctor is going to honor that because it's a patient request, and people don't request these things out of nowhere. I wish people asked for it more. So that's something to kind of spread in the community too, that you can always ask for a palliative care consult. And I think it's important to know that.
Thank you so much, Sunita.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
For being here. Thank you to everyone who showed up today and brought so much to this conversation. Thank you to Dara for all you do to hold space for this. Yeah, thank you so much. Next week, we're going to have Reverend Corey Kennard with us on Thursday, and I'm really looking forward to that conversation. And I hope to see you guys all back here. Dara, I'll let you finish up. Thank you guys. Thank you,
Thank you,
Sunita.
Claire.
Yeah, thank you, Sunita. Thank you, Claire. That was incredibly helpful to me. I was, I don't know, taking it in personally and just based on some of my friends' experiences right now. I'm going to share what you shared. I just put a bunch of links in the chat, including Sunita's website, and we're going to be sending information in the follow-up email. So if you don't want to copy it right now, that's okay. As well as a link to the talk next week with Pastor Corey Kennard, who has done a lot of work around the racial disparities in the end of life. And he's just a wonderful person. And then we have the vigil, as I mentioned, coming up on the 9th. I've also posted some upcoming Dose of Togetherness events, one tomorrow and one on Monday that might interest you. I also just wanted to mention that we do appreciate any donations to support this work. And I included that link as well as the virtual memorial guide that we just released about a week ago with Quarantine that has helpful both like slide templates, but kind of step-by-step kind of actions that you can take to create a beautiful memorial. So. But I think that's it. If everybody wants to go off mute for a second and just say goodbye so we can hear your beautiful voices, that's always a nice way to end.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dara. Thank you.
Thank
you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Be well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for
program.
Thank you. Great. Okay, I'm gonna end it. But
Thanks, everybody.
bye.
Thanks.